In October 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter and the 4th Cavalry were assigned a dangerous mission to track down the Comanche, a task filled with peril and uncertainty. The ongoing Comanche raids had rendered the frontier uninhabitable for settlers. Just 2 years prior, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had connected the coasts, yet a vast swath of land at the heart of the nation, known as Comancheria, remained unbeaten and fiercely guarded. The harsh realities of the high plains, coupled with the uncompromising resistance of its inhabitants, made Comancheria a no-man's land for decades. Wagon trains and soldiers who ventured into this territory disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing but chilling whispers about their fate. The region transformed into a place of haunting nightmares for those living on its borders. For the settlers near Comancheria, these fears became a grim reality with a marked increase in Comanche raids. As Lieutenant Carter entered this treacherous land, he recognized that although he approached as the hunter, he could easily become the prey. Was the army truly prepared to face the Comanche, who had long established themselves as the dominant force in the region, with their exceptional skills in warfare and formidable tactics? 2 years into Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, it had become clear that his policies regarding Native Americans were struggling. While he was pragmatic in some areas and idealistic in others, Grant understood that westward expansion was inevitable. However, his policies did not effectively address the rising tensions between settlers and indigenous tribes. The painting American Progress by John Gast encapsulates this era, illustrating how settlers pushed westward, supported by the nation's infrastructure and ambition, seizing land while displacing Native Americans and decimating the buffalo herds that were vital to many indigenous communities. Grant's approach to Native Americans centered on assimilation, a concept he believed would shield indigenous tribes from the encroachment of white settlers. In correspondence with General William T. Sherman, Grant expressed hope that his policies would protect Native communities while leading them toward what he considered a civilized existence characterized by Christianity and societal integration. Although these ideas were contentious, they were clearly laid out in his first inaugural address. Yet, what occurs when a group refuses to accept imposed religions or lifestyles? Among those who resisted with unparalleled resolve were the Comanche, recognized as one of the most powerful and fearsome tribes. The Comanche built their reputation not just on their prowess in warfare, but also on the devastating impact their raids inflicted on settlers and rival tribes. No other Native American group in the West could compare to the death and destruction they caused. As American settlers moved further into Comancheria, violent conflicts surged. Life along the borders of this territory became fraught with danger, as settlers often fell victim to Comanche raids. These raids, frequently conducted in collaboration with their Kiowa allies, were notorious for their brutal efficiency. For those living on the frontier's edge, survival was a constant battle, and the threat from the Comanche loomed large. As reports of settler casualties rose, Grant's commitment to peace began to waver. Military leaders voiced increasing concern over the exodus of settlers fleeing the frontier. One colonel famously cautioned that if Indian marauders were not punished, the entire country risked becoming entirely depopulated. These statements reflected the growing frustration among settlers and military officials who began to view peaceful strategies as ineffective against groups like the Comanche. By 1871, public and military sentiment had started to shift dramatically. The tipping point arrived that year during one of the most brutal and horrifying raids ever recorded, compelling both the government and military to reevaluate their strategies. The brutal events of May 18, 1871, marked a turning point in the U.S. government's approach to dealing with the Comanche and their allies. On that fateful day, a wagon train of 12 men was making its way across Salt Creek Prairie, carrying vital supplies for the forts in Texas. As they moved through the vast plains, their journey took a horrifying turn. On the horizon, they spotted a large band of warriors, both Kiowa and Comanche. Henry Warren, the leader of the wagon train, acted quickly, ordering his men to form a defensive circle, a common tactic in such encounters. However, against over 100 seasoned warriors, their efforts were futile. The Comanche and Kiowa descended upon the wagon train with overwhelming force, leaving the men little chance to defend themselves. In the chaos, 5 members of the wagon train managed to escape. The warriors, distracted by looting the supplies, did not pursue the fleeing men. One survivor, desperate and determined, reached Fort Richardson and recounted the massacre to the soldiers stationed there. Lieutenant Robert Carter and a detachment of the 4th Cavalry were sent to investigate. What they found shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers. Carter later wrote that there could be nothing more appalling, heart-rending, or sickening to the human senses than the spectacle of the Salt Creek Prairie Massacre. The victims had been stripped, scalped, and horribly mutilated. 7 men lay dead, their bodies pierced by countless arrows resembling human porcupines. Some victims had been decapitated, and one man, who had evidently fought back, suffered a gruesome fate, captured, tied to a wagon wheel, and burned alive over a fire. In a twist of fate, General William T. Sherman and his small party had passed by the area just an hour earlier, narrowly avoiding the attack. This coincidence marked a significant turning point. Sherman, deeply shaken by the brutality of the massacre, quickly called upon Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie, known as Bad Hand due to a wartime injury, to lead efforts in bringing the perpetrators to justice. McKenzie, a seasoned Civil War veteran, was still learning how to navigate the unique challenges of warfare on the high plains. His leadership would prove pivotal in the U.S. military's campaign against the Comanche. In the aftermath of the massacre, arrests came swiftly. A prominent Kiowa chief, Satanta, openly admitted to leading the attack. He justified the violence by citing the U.S. government's broken promises, its failure to provide the goods promised to his people, and its plans to build railroads through their territory. Satanta and a few other chiefs were convicted and imprisoned for the killings. This event signaled a dramatic shift in U.S. policy toward native tribes. The mounting destruction on the frontier was becoming too severe to ignore. Settlers reported hundreds of deaths over the years, pleading for Sherman to take decisive action. Although the Salt Creek Massacre was primarily orchestrated by the Kiowa, the Comanche, specifically the Quahadi Band, were notorious for their frequent and devastating raids. The Quahadi, known as the most unyielding and hostile of the Comanche, had long refused to submit to treaties or reservation life. They would not even trade directly with whites. Ironically, their chief, Quanah Parker, was the product of a Comanche raid. In 1836, Cynthia Ann Parker was captured as a child during an attack on Parker's fort. She was adopted by the Comanche and later married Chief Peta Nocona. Their son, Quanah, would rise to become the final and legendary chief of the Comanche. For decades, the Quahadi terrorized wagon trains and Texas Rangers who dared to approach their territory. They were expert horsemen, cunning strategists, and deadly warriors. By the 1870s, they had acquired firearms, but their traditional bows remained their most lethal weapon. A skilled Comanche archer could fire 20 arrows per minute, with each arrow capable of reaching targets up to 60 yards away. By September 1871, the military finally received orders to act. General Sherman declared that the Quahadi must be punished and pursued. The era of hesitation had ended. It was time to confront the Comanche in their own land, the so-called Wolf's Den. The mission was clear: bring the Quahadi to the reservation by force, or eliminate them entirely. But as Lieutenant Carter and his men would soon discover, finding the Comanche was only part of the challenge. Surviving the encounter would prove to be just as difficult. The mission was to confront the Comanche in their territory, known as the Wolf's Den. The objective was clear: either force the Quahadi onto the reservation or eliminate them completely. However, as Lieutenant Carter and his men understood, locating them was only half the battle. Surviving the encounter would be equally challenging. The Quahadi, a fiercely independent band of the Comanche, roamed the high plains, a harsh region that was one of the last to be subdued by the U.S. military. And for good reason. This land acted as a natural fortress, with its unforgiving climate and difficult geography, serving both as a refuge for the Comanche and a nightmare for potential invaders. In his celebrated book Empire of the Summer Moon, S.C. Gwynne vividly illustrates the region's brutality. The high plains lacked timber and water, and were home to one of the harshest climates in North America. Summers brought scorching heat and fierce winds often exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, capable of wiping out entire crops in days. The relentless winds caused eyes to sting, lips to crack, and bodies to dehydrate quickly. In fall and winter, powerful northerly winds could drastically drop temperatures by 50 degrees in just 1 hour. A blue norther was especially notorious for bringing icy rain. Within the high plains lay the Llano Estacado, or the Staked Plains, a term coined by early Spanish explorers. The name reflected the terrain's featureless expanse, an endless sea of grassland where one could easily become disoriented without physical landmarks. General Randolph Marcy described the Llano Estacado in 1852 as an ocean-like view, devoid of any trees or shrubs, presenting a monotonous vastness. He believed no one could live permanently in such barren conditions, yet he was mistaken. The Quahadi thrived in this environment, turning the harshness to their advantage. As a horse tribe, the high plains were not a limitation, but a lifeline for the Quahadi. The flat terrain acted as natural highways, enabling them to cover astonishing distances in a day. Their horses, integral to their way of life, found plenty of grazing lands across the plains. Though water sources were rare, the Quahadi were well acquainted with hidden springs and streams, providing them a crucial advantage over outsiders. Most importantly, the high plains were home to vast buffalo herds, which were essential to the Comanche people. Buffalo provided food, shelter, clothing, and tools, serving as a sacred and vital component of their culture. This land was worth defending at any cost. The Comanches' mastery of horseback warfare established them as an unmatched force in North America, a reputation they upheld into the 1840s. For years, slow-moving armies posed little threat to them. The Comanche chose their battles wisely, engaging only when the odds favored them. Their arrows, expertly crafted and shot with impressive speed and accuracy, were far superior to the cumbersome muzzle-loading rifles that their opponents used. However, this advantage began to diminish as technology advanced. In 1844, Texas Rangers introduced a revolutionary weapon to the battlefield, the Colt revolver. This innovative firearm featured a 5-round cylinder, allowing for rapid firing, an impressive upgrade compared to the slow reload times of older rifles. Rangers keen to maintain firepower during skirmishes would carry preloaded cylinders that could be swapped out quickly, ensuring continuous shooting. The effectiveness of this new technology was evident at the Battle of Walker's Creek, where rapid-fire tactics proved capable of challenging the Comanche on more equal footing. By the 1870s, firearm technology had advanced significantly. By the 1870s, the U.S. military had made significant advancements in weaponry, equipping its cavalry with Spencer carbines, highly accurate rifles featuring a 7-round magazine. The lever action mechanism allowed for a rate of fire comparable to that of a skilled Comanche archer, but with far greater range. This technological leap finally gave the U.S. Army the tools needed to engage the Comanche in sustained battles. However, even with these advancements, the Comanche still held a critical advantage. They didn't have to fight unless they wanted to. The vast, open plains were their greatest ally. Comanche warriors often traveled with multiple horses, keeping some rested and ready for high-speed retreats or pursuits. Chasing them was a dangerous endeavor. The plains were an ocean of grass, where losing one's bearings was easy, and supply lines stretched thin. Without intimate knowledge of the terrain, finding water could become a life-or-death challenge. And all of this assumed that the pursuers didn't lose their horses, an essential lifeline in the unforgiving landscape. Many Texas Rangers lost their lives attempting to match the Comanche in their own domain. The Comanche's mastery of the environment, combined with their tactical brilliance, made them nearly invincible. No one had yet proven capable of defeating them decisively on their home turf. That changed when Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie, known as Bad Hand, due to a severe war injury, was given an unprecedented order. Not just to defend the settlers on the Texas frontier, but to actively hunt the Comanche in the heart of their homeland. In late September 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter received orders from Colonel McKenzie to track down the elusive Quahadi Comanche. Finding their main village was no simple task. The Quahadi were masters of evasion, constantly moving to avoid detection. The mission led Carter and his men to the area near Blanco Canyon, east of the Caprock Escarpment. This region, with its low rolling plains, ravines, and canyons, was an ideal hiding spot for the Comanche, especially during their frequent raids in the fall. McKenzie's force was formidable. 600 men, primarily cavalry from the 4th Regiment, along with 20 Tonkawa scouts, fierce enemies of the Comanche and expert trackers. It was hoped that their skills and knowledge would provide a crucial advantage. Yet Carter observed hesitation among the Tonkawa. While their bravery was unquestionable, he wondered whether they truly wished to confront the Comanche. Their instincts, honed over years of experience, seemed to hint at caution. For 10 long days, the expedition found no trace of the Quahadi. But on the evening of October 9th, everything changed. The Tonkawa scouts noticed something unusual. 4 Comanche riders in the distance, silently watching the Americans. It was unclear how long they had been there. Perhaps they had been observing the Americans all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Or maybe their presence was a deliberate message, letting the Americans know they were being watched. When the scouts tried to give chase, the Comanche relied on a classic tactic: fresh mounts. Their well-rested horses outpaced the military's exhausted ones, and the Comanche quickly vanished into the rolling hills near Blanco Canyon. The Tonkawa were convinced the Americans were close to the Quahadi village, but this also meant they were dangerously near to their adversaries. That night, the Americans made critical errors. Campfires were lit for light and warmth, serving as beacons on the dark plains. Some regiments left their horses unguarded, confident that the Comanche wouldn't return. As midnight approached, the camp was quiet, save for the grazing sounds of horses tied at their lariats. Carter later recounted the events of that night in his book, On the Border with McKenzie. He described the stillness being shattered by a blood-curdling yell, followed by a gunshot. In an instant, chaos erupted. Carter wrote, "A yell followed by a shot rang down the valley. Then, in quick succession, a dozen shots, one after the other. A rush, and in an instant, our whole camp was aroused. The ridge, or line of small foothills which skirted our entire camp, was alive with wild Indians riding at full speed, shaking dry buffalo robes, ringing bells, and yelling like wild demons. The attack was swift and calculated. Officers shouted commands as the soldiers tried to regain their composure. Then Carter realized the Comanche's true objective: the horses. Amid the chaos, the thunderous sound of a stampede roared through the camp. The Comanche had succeeded in driving the animals away, leaving soldiers scrambling to grab the lariats. The leather tore through their hands as the herds of horses disappeared into the darkness, carried off by the Comanche. By the time the dust settled, 70 horses and mules were lost. A large portion of the force was left stranded without mounts. The Comanche didn't need to continue their attack. Their strategy was simple yet devastating. Deprive the soldiers of their horses and let the harsh geography of the plains do the rest. Without mounts, the Americans were effectively immobilized, unable to carry sufficient supplies or reach water sources. The attack was a masterstroke of Comanche strategy. They had been watching the camp, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their timing was perfect, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them the upper hand. The unguarded horses provided an easy target, and the Comanche delivered a crippling blow without suffering a single casualty. Carter later described this as the first tragedy of Blanco Canyon. It was a stark reminder of the tactical brilliance of the Comanche and the perils of underestimating their expertise in warfare. The line of small foothills that skirted the entire camp came alive with the sight of wild Comanche warriors riding at full speed. They shook dry buffalo robes, rang bells, and yelled like wild demons. The attack was swift and calculated. Officers shouted commands as the soldiers tried to regain their composure. Then, Lieutenant Carter realized the Comanche's true objective: the horses. Amid the chaos, the thunderous sound of a stampede roared through the camp. The Comanche had succeeded in driving the animals away, leaving soldiers scrambling to grab the lariats. The leather tore through their hands as the herds of horses disappeared into the darkness, carried off by the Comanche. By the time the dust settled, 70 horses and mules were lost. A large portion of the force was left stranded without mounts. The Comanche didn't need to continue their attack. Their strategy was simple yet devastating: deprive the soldiers of their horses and let the harsh geography of the plains do the rest. Without mounts, the Americans were effectively immobilized, unable to carry sufficient supplies or reach water sources. The attack was a masterstroke of Comanche strategy. They had been watching the camp, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their timing was perfect, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them the upper hand. The unguarded horses provided an easy target, and the Comanche delivered a crippling blow without suffering a single casualty. Carter later described this as the first tragedy of Blanco Canyon. It was a stark reminder of the tactical brilliance of the Comanche and the perils of underestimating their expertise in warfare. 3 more tragedies would follow, but this first strike set the tone for the challenges to come. In late September 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter and his men received orders to track down the elusive Quahadi Comanche. After an ambush the previous night had cost the army over 70 horses, Carter knew their next move was critical. By morning, the Tonkawa scouts, known for their tracking skills, picked up the trail of the stampeding horses. Carter, joined by Captain Edward Hale and a group of soldiers, set out to recover what they could. Among the group was Private Sander Gregg, a man Carter trusted implicitly, along with other seasoned companions. However, the remaining soldiers under Hale's command were inexperienced recruits, men Carter had never served with before. The group followed the trail for about 2 miles when they spotted a small band of Comanche rounding up some of the stolen horses. The Comanche immediately fled on horseback, leading the soldiers into the treacherous terrain of ravines and arroyos. Carter and the others gave chase, unaware they were being lured into a trap. As they crested a small hill, Carter and his men saw the full scale of the danger they had walked into. Below them, at the base of the bluff, the ground was alive with mounted Comanche warriors, hundreds of them. Their bodies were painted for war, and they wore feathered headdresses as they charged toward the soldiers with blood-curdling whoops and yells. Captain Hale was the first to speak. "Heavens, but we are in a nest," he said. Carter knew their situation was dire. With no cover and vastly outnumbered, they would have to retreat carefully to survive. Carter quickly ordered the men to spread into a line, using suppressive fire from their Spencer carbines to slow the Comanche advance. He hoped the sound of gunfire would alert the main force, prompting Colonel McKenzie to send reinforcements. The Comanche hesitated momentarily, but their numbers and ferocity soon overcame the advantage of the soldiers' superior weaponry. Among the warriors, a commanding figure emerged, Quanah Parker, the Quahadi chief. Covered in black war paint, his presence exuded a terrifying mix of authority and menace. As Carter watched, he noticed Parker at the forefront, rallying his warriors and driving them forward. Behind the warriors, Carter could hear the cries of Comanche women urging their men to press the attack. He realized they had stumbled upon a Comanche village, the heart of the Quahadi stronghold. Amid the chaos, panic began to set in. Captain Hale and several of his inexperienced recruits broke ranks, attempting to flee on horseback. Carter, furious at their desertion, yelled for them to hold their ground. But it was too late. The Comanche, mounted on fresh horses, would easily outrun them. As Carter predicted, the fleeing soldiers were swiftly hunted down and killed. With Hale and his men gone, the focus of the Comanche shifted back to Carter and the remaining 5 soldiers. The group continued to retreat toward the arroyo, using their carbines to hold the Comanche at bay. The soldiers dismounted and used their horses as shields, but the relentless attacks took their toll. Arrows flew with deadly precision, striking 2 of Carter's men, one in the hand, another in the arm. The Comanche tightened their circle, their long poles adorned with scalps waving like macabre trophies. Carter ordered his men to keep firing, knowing their only chance lay in making a final dash for cover. As the moment came, Carter gave the order. "Now, men, bunch your shots, pump it into them, and make a dash for your lives. It is all we can do." With a final volley, the soldiers mounted their horses and raced toward the arroyo. Private Sander Gregg, riding just 10 yards to Carter's right, suddenly shouted that his horse was faltering. Carter turned to see Quanah Parker and a group of warriors closing in. Their horses thundered across the plains, and Parker, smeared in black war paint, exuded a terrifying, almost inhuman joy. Carter described him as the incarnation of savage, brutal joy, his features made even more fearsome by the war paint. Parker expertly maneuvered his horse, using Gregg's slower mount as cover to avoid Carter's line of fire. Carter yelled for Gregg to draw his 6-shooter, but it was too late. Parker raised his pistol and fired. Gregg fell from his horse, dead. Carter watched in horror as the scene unfolded, powerless to intervene. This was the second tragedy of Blanco Canyon. With his men battered and morale shaken, Carter fully expected that he and the remaining soldiers would meet the same fate. But then, their fortunes shifted. Without even stopping to take a trophy, Quanah Parker and the Comanche warriors abruptly turned and retreated. For a brief, surreal moment, Lieutenant Robert Carter realized their lives had been spared. Then he saw the reason why. Cresting a distant hill, the Tonkawa scouts appeared, charging into view with war whoops and screams, rallying to join the fight. Behind them, a massive cloud of dust rose on the horizon. Colonel McKenzie had heard the gunfire, just as Carter had hoped, and the main force was now advancing to their aid. Carter's mind flashed back to the cries of the Comanche women earlier in the battle. It suddenly became clear. Parker was retreating because the village was nearby. He had to get his people on the move before the Americans arrived. While Comanche warriors on fresh mounts could evade soldiers with ease, a village filled with women, children, and elders was a different matter entirely. The villages were designed for mobility, but they still carried their materials, and their pace was far slower than that of mounted warriors or soldiers. As Mackenzie's forces advanced, they picked up the straggling Captain Hale, who had fled earlier. Now, with 500 soldiers at their backs, the Americans began to chase the retreating Comanche toward the Caprock Escarpment and the climb to the high plains. It was a relentless pursuit. As the Americans drew closer, the Comanche retreated up the side of a steep bluff. From the top, Comanche women screamed down at the soldiers below, urging their warriors on. Comanche marksmen provided cover for Quanah's group as they ascended the bluff. Across the battlefield, the Tonkawa scouts hurled insults at their longtime enemies, heightening the chaos of the scene. Mackenzie's forces were not far behind. Carter, leading a group of men, charged up a narrow trail in pursuit of the fleeing warriors. The trail twisted sharply, and as his horse rounded a corner too quickly, disaster struck. Carter's leg slammed into a boulder jutting from the side of the trail. The impact echoed like the crack of a pistol. The pain from the pistol shot was excruciating, blurring his vision until everything went dark. The next thing he knew, he was being revived by his men, who offered him water as he lay on the ground. By then, the Comanche were vanishing into the hills and ravines, their horses far fresher than those of the Americans, giving them the speed and endurance needed to escape. Quanah Parker had accomplished his mission. He had warned the village and led his warriors to safety. The Americans were left with nothing but empty land. For Carter, this marked the third tragedy of Blanco Canyon, and there was still one more to come. After the Comanche had disappeared into the distance, Lieutenant Robert Carter returned to the spot where Private Sander Gregg had fallen. Despite his own severe leg injury, Carter, with the help of his men, ensured his friend received a proper burial. The day's tragic events had unfolded before noon, yet by 2:30 p.m., the Tonkawa scouts reported finding the Comanche trail again. They were certain it would lead to Quanah Parker and the Comanche village. Only then did Carter allow himself to tend to his injury. His leg was swollen, stiff, and worsening. His boots had to be cut off, revealing a leg blackened with bruises, lacerated, and crusted with dried blood. Though it wasn't broken, the injury was severe. The doctor splinted it as a precaution, but there was no time for further treatment. Trumpets signaled the troops to prepare their mounts, and Carter was summoned to Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie's side. McKenzie informed Carter that some soldiers would be sent back to the fort due to their stolen mounts, leaving them unable to continue the pursuit. He offered Carter the chance to return with them to receive proper medical care. Exhausted and demoralized, Carter hesitated, but ultimately refused. He remembered Gregg and the purpose of their mission. His reply was firm. "If it is left to me, I go forward with the command." Satisfied, McKenzie allowed Carter to stay, but questioned him about Captain Edward Hale, whose earlier retreat had endangered the entire unit. Carter, however, refused to say more than that Hale and his men had made a mistake. With that, Carter mounted his horse, ignoring the pain, and continued with the expedition. The soldiers followed the Tonkawa scouts along the Brazos River, moving west toward the Caprock Escarpment. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the canyon, which opened into a broad valley. There, they found the remnants of a massive Comanche village. The village had been abandoned in haste. Over 1,000 people, 3,000 horses, and countless supplies had moved on, leaving behind lodge poles, tools, and even valuables scattered across the ground. The Comanche trail was fresh but deceptive, as they had crisscrossed their path to confuse their pursuers, buying themselves precious time. Still, the Tonkawas were able to follow the signs. The army pushed forward, climbing the 1,000-foot ascent of the Caprock Escarpment, a grueling task for both soldiers and horses. Carter, grateful for his mount, marveled at how the Comanche had managed to move an entire village through such treacherous terrain. When they reached the plateau, Carter described the scene as a vast, uninterrupted plain stretching endlessly, comparable only to the ocean in its immensity. Yet, the challenges of the high plains were unforgiving. By early afternoon, temperatures dropped sharply, and a rare early-season norther was brewing. As the wind howled and temperatures plummeted, the soldiers found themselves racing against time. The Tonkawa scouts pressed on, following trails through buffalo grass and steep ravines. In the distance, silhouettes appeared on a small ridge. The Comanche village was within sight, just 2 or 3 miles ahead. But as the soldiers moved closer, the norther struck. Bitter winds, sleet, and snow battered the men and animals. Carter wrote, "The air grew thicker and more hazy. A cold rain mingled with snow and sleet began to drive into our faces, through our bodies, and into the very marrow. This was the supreme moment. A crisis. Despite the worsening storm, McKenzie pushed his men forward. Discarded equipment, lodge poles, tools, and even buffalo skins littered the trail, evidence of the Comanches' desperate attempt to lighten their load. Puppies abandoned by the Comanche whimpered in the freezing wind as soldiers scavenged for useful supplies. Carter, caught up in the frenzy of the pursuit, barely noticed his injured leg. The Tonkawa scouts painted themselves for battle, preparing for what they believed would be a final confrontation. However, the weather would decide otherwise. Just as the army was poised to strike, Colonel McKenzie called off the attack. Temperatures had plummeted below freezing, and 50 mph winds tore through the soldiers' thin summer uniforms. McKenzie knew his men and horses could not endure much more. The storm raged throughout the night. Soldiers constructed makeshift shelters from buffalo hides and huddled together for warmth. McKenzie himself had to be wrapped in a buffalo robe to stave off hypothermia. By morning, the storm had passed, revealing a clear, beautiful day, but it was too late. The Comanche village had vanished. The norther had given the Comanche the time they needed to escape, leaving the soldiers with nothing but frustration. They were now 40 miles from their supply lines, with rations dwindling and horses showing signs of exhaustion. Reluctantly, McKenzie ordered a retreat. Carter reflected bitterly, "By that lucky storm for them, the Comanche still had a night's march ahead of us." The failure stung deeply. Despite their relentless pursuit, the Comanche had once again outmaneuvered the Americans. To make matters worse, on their way back to Blanco Canyon, McKenzie was wounded by an arrow during a skirmish with 2 Comanche stragglers. Another soldier was also severely injured in the aftermath. Both Carter and McKenzie eventually recovered from their injuries, and Carter would later be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery during the retreat. While the mission failed to achieve its immediate goals, it signaled a turning point. As historian S.C. Gwynn noted, the U.S. military was signaling their intent not just to protect the frontier, but to destroy the raiders themselves, to find the wolves in their den and kill them. Within 4 years, the Comanche would be forced onto reservations. At the forefront of this campaign was Bad Hand McKenzie, whose relentless pursuit of the Quahadi had shifted the balance of power in Comancheria forever.